This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 756 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. There's been a lot of talk about how this year's wide receiver draft class just isn't very good. I think some of that stems from the fact that recent classes have been awesome, and this one just looks bad in comparison. But there's definitely merit to the idea that we're not looking at some unbelievable wide receiver class. With that being said, I'd argue that in draft classes like this one, it's even more important to have a good grasp on the group. Because strong fantasy assets are going to emerge, even if the class in general doesn't look so hot. And is there anyone better to analyze this class than my friend Matt Harmon? Harmon's a football writer and analyst for Yahoo Sports and Yahoo Fantasy. But he also has his side hustle called Reception Perception, which is his unique methodology for wide receiver evaluation. I sat down and talked to Matt about Reception Perception itself, and then, of course, this year's wide receiver class. We talked about Jaxon Smith-Njigba's lack of perimeter work in college, Jordan Addison's production dip last season, Zay Flowers Antonio Brown comps, and so much more. It was a treat to be able to sit with Matt and talk about this sort of unpredictable draft class, and I guarantee that you walk away from our conversation with a little bit more knowledge. So here he is, Mr. Reception Perception himself, Matt Harmon. All right, Matt, so Reception Perception has been a huge hit since you launched it. Can you describe your process and sort of what Reception Perception is all about?
Well, I appreciate you calling it a huge hit. That's very kind. Not as popular as some of Boy Young Boy's early albums, but but a reasonable, maybe not a platinum hit, but a reasonable hit. So Reception Perception, when I was trying to break my way into the industry many years ago, it was essentially, all right, how do I answer the biggest pressing question that I have about football? And for me, it was with wide receivers. And this was in around 2013 is when I started coming up with the process of Reception Perception. For me, it's like, what are wide receivers doing when they're running off screen? Because anybody that plays, watches games knows like, oh yeah, you're following the ball. These receivers run off screen. You don't really know what's going on there. And anybody that plays fantasy or follows the league knows that wide receiver production is so inherently dependent on other variables and other factors. I mean, you're lucky if you're a receiver to get like 8 to 10 targets in a game, but you're still running like 30 plus routes. You're playing like 50 plus snaps. So what's going on when how can we credit wide receivers with the things that they're doing on a play-by-play basis that doesn't have to do with those outside variables? So that was really where Reception Perception came from, trying to quantify route running and receiver performance beyond just the stat sheet. So what I do with Reception Perception is over an 8-game sample for NFL players or college players is I go in and watch everything that happens, baby. Every route that they run, how often they run each route type, how often they get open against man, press, zone coverage. Because to me, the one thing a wide receiver can control is how often do they go out there and get open and create a good target for themselves to get from the quarterback and earn targets from an offensive play caller or a team decision maker. And again, obviously the quarterback as well. So everything basically like trying to put it into a quantifiable percentage, easy to understand for readers and viewers out there to really understand everything about the wide receiver position beyond just the route running aspect and how often they get open. Where are they lining up and where does everything trickle down from there? Because this, JJ, and obviously your listeners know this because they're smart as hell. Every type of wide receiver is so different. And we're going to talk about it with this class is a great example that like some of these guys look completely different from other players and trying to compare them to, with specific types, I think is important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a great example of that, and we'll get into this class right now, is with Jaxon Smith-Njigba. It took a second. I think that now he's the consensus wide receiver one. If you were to say or ask that back in January, even February, some had Quentin Johnston, some had Jordan Addison, some still do, but I think most people have JSN at their wide receiver one spot. Does your analysis agree, first off? And then what do you have to say about the fact that he didn't really have this big sample size sort of playing the perimeter in college? Obviously, we know the second to last, sophomore season, plays with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, great, phenomenal perimeter players. So there's a reason why he played the slot, obviously, but we just don't have a massive sample size of him playing on the outside. So what do you have to say about that? And what do you have to say about him just in general as a prospect?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. One thing I did this year on the reception perception site, people can find it right now, is I took my draft board, my draft rankings, because everybody loves rankings, and stacked them together the last three classes, because I think one of the big talking points with this class in general is is it weaker? How does it compare to previous year's classes? And JSN's a great way to talk about this because number one, I do think he stands in a tier of his own in this class to me in terms of the quality of wide receivers, but I don't think that he, as a prospect, despite the fact that Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who you mentioned, have said this to me, they've said this to many others, and I know they're trying to hype their boy up, but at the same time, I give it a little bit of credence that they think he is the best player of the three of them. I slightly disagree with that. I think that those guys were in a tier above JSN as well. But to me, I do think the reception perception would agree that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is not just the best player in this class, but like you mentioned, when you're looking at a guy who ran almost exclusively as a slot receiver, and in the games that I sampled for him, he was in the slot on 83% of his snaps, and he was off the line of scrimmage for 80.3% of his snaps. And that actually is a big distinguisher that we certainly don't talk about it enough in fantasy, but I don't think we talk about it enough in general, that there's a huge difference. Like, we just think outside wide receivers and how do they match up with outside cornerbacks, but there's a big difference between playing that X receiver position and playing the flanker position. And with the flanker, you're able to move them around pre-snap. And I think there's more similarities to what a flanker receiver does as a zone beating receiver to what a slot receiver does on the inside than really what that X receiver doing, which is the most difficult position, and you're going to run the most difficult route. So I think, though, when you're trying to move like a guy who played exclusively in the slot and you're trying to get them like reps against outside, or like trying to project them to reps outside in the NFL, it's important to look at how often they beat man coverage on the inside. It's not going to be the same as on man coverage on the outside, but it is a pretty good indicator. And when you look at JSN in reception perception among prospects sampled, he's at the 86th percentile in success rate versus man coverage. He has the second best success rate versus man coverage of 75% in this class among the guys I've sampled. And it's a tiny sample. JJ, only 4.8% of his routes sampled, so a very small handful. But he has an 83% success rate versus press on those routes, and which I think is important if you're projecting him as to, I think slot only, it's almost like we're trying to use that as the new pejorative when slot receiver just used to be the pejorative term for receivers. I don't think that JSN is necessarily a guy that you have to play in the slot. Like, if you're going to go into two receiver sets, he could be a guy that plays off the line of scrimmage as that flanker because of what he does on not just against man coverage, but especially on routes like dig routes, out routes, those intermediate routes, not just the little pop gun slot receiver routes, which is my pejorative for slot receivers. I think that you see enough from there to have him be more of a full field guy.
I think the other thing with him, if we're looking at this from a fantasy perspective, is that if a team is going to draft him in the top 15, let's say, they're not going to use him like Cole Beasley.
Yeah.
It's not logical to go that route. It's much more logical to say, okay, yeah, he can win in the slot. He can win in that area of the field. He can win like Keenan Allen or even like a CD Lamb who plays a lot there. That's fine. And that can still be very, very productive. Even Cooper Kupp, that can still be very, very productive, from a fantasy perspective. And I think that's sort of lost in all of this too, where I understand I think there is at least some fear or some red flag involved in this, just because it wasn't like we had this perfect sample of him playing everywhere. But at the same time, if a team sees that eval in that way, and then you obviously see him being able to win on the outside in different ways, a team's not going to just spend that draft capital to use him in that way.
I mean, but even before I got into really diving into JSN and really diving into this entire class, like, you brought up the name Cooper Kupp, and like, can we really have, he's only a slot receiver, be like the first negative that we write down for a player when Cooper Kupp just led the damn league in yards, catches, and touchdowns 2 years ago and was like the best receiver in football, playing not as a slot only player, like
exclusive,
Cole,
right?
Like a Cole Beasley type is a great like that. That's a pop gun slot receiver, or Jamison Crowder, like a pop gun slot receiver. But that's kind of my point, in that even within typical positional archetypes like slot outside, there's going to be so many different guys, even within this class, where there are guys that might be some of those smaller guys, but then there are these power slot players like a Cooper Kupp or Amon-Ra St. Brown. Keenan Allen, I think, is a perfect comparison for JSN, because Keenan Allen has been like an elite tier route runner, despite doing some slot, like 50-50 slot outside in certain seasons. And he is certainly it's certainly been one of the best receivers of this era, in my opinion. And I think JSN can reach that type of ceiling. And, again, is that a superstar, like elite level player? Maybe, but it's certainly a really good guy that's going to be great, and I think in the NFL for a long time.
So my wide receiver 2 in this class, I'd be curious to see where you have him, is Jordan Addison. Obviously I'm a product of the University of Pittsburgh as well. And so, let's shift those biases and push them aside. But he was so good at Pitt, a couple of years ago with Kenny Pickett. And then that production did take a pretty big dip when he transferred to USC. So do you think that's a problem at all? Did you see anything that suggested that there was a problem there? Or do you just have any problems to his profile that you've seen?
So I think my theory on why he was a little bit less of a fit, I guess, in USC based on what he did at Pitt. And his 2022 sample that's on the website is only USC games, but I did go back and look at a handful of Pitt games as well, just to sort of try to understand the differences in the usage there, at least. And I think it does come back to usage. My biggest, and it comes also to my biggest problem with Jordan Addison as a prospect, and problem in quotes there. I think where he struggles the most is when USC would line him up as that X receiver outside on the line of scrimmage, and corners would get up on him and play physical press coverage. I have a different receiver ranked second in the class, who we'll talk about, I'm sure, here in a second. He's my third ranked guy, Jordan Addison. I went back and forth between these two players for a long time. The success rate versus man and zone overall between that player and Jordan Addison are very similar, but where the difference is, Jordan Addison came in at 51.1% success rate versus press. That's a 17th percentile mark. It's one of the weaker ones in this class. And I think where you really see it is when, again, he would line up as that X receiver, a corner be right on him, and he needed to run like a true go route. Like his 9-route success rate is very low, bringing down some of that press coverage score. But I think Pitt did a really great job of, moving him off the line of scrimmage, moving him as a slot player, because his slant route, dig route, and curl route success rates are absurdly high. Even his post route success rate is very high. And I think for his NFL team, he's probably going to have to play as a flanker. He's probably going to have to play as even maybe like a 40 to 50% slot guy to get him free from some of that stuff. And if you think about him with a strong arm quarterback, like a Justin Herbert or a Josh Allen, rifling in some of those throws where he's so open on those deep and intermediate in-breaking routes, he's going to be a great fit there. So I really like Jordan Addison as a player. I actually think he's kind of similar to Jahan Dotson last year, and I was really high on Dotson. I like Dotson as a player. I actually think I like Dotson a little bit more than I like Addison, but just a really good consummate number 2 receiver is kind of how I view Jordan Addison. And I think that route running success on those in-breaking routes, I mean, you could pile up production if you're fit with the right quarterback there.
Yeah, actually, Dotson was one of my model's comps for Addison, so that's good to hear. So back to the point about him playing on the perimeter and playing up against these corners. Did you see a similar because obviously the BMI debate, the size debate is always a thing at the wide receiver position, and will always be a thing at the wide receiver position. And it was a massive thing when Devontae Smith was coming out. Yeah. And so I'm curious, because I think a lot of people hearing that from you would be curious too. Did you see similar things with a player like Devontae Smith when he was coming out as you did with Jordan Addison?
No. If you actually look back at Devontae Smith's reception perception from that year, 84th percentile success rate versus press, 78%. So the gap there is massive between Addison and Devontae Smith. And I think Smith was he was absurdly athletic. He was an incredible actually, I messed up there. That was actually his rookie year, that Devontae Smith's reception perception numbers I was just quoting there. It's actually even better, 78.9% success rate versus press his final year at Alabama, 89th percentile that mark among college prospects. So even better. And I think Devontae Smith, number one, he's longer in terms of a wingspan. He can use his arms to get off the line of scrimmage a little bit better. He can fight through that physicality a little bit better. And I think he was just an overall better athlete too, in terms of his quickness, short area burst, a little bit better than Jordan Addison. Yeah, I would say in terms of two guys whose size shows up more, it's certainly Jordan Addison as compared to Devontae Smith.
Quentin Johnston. I feel like he's got to be the most polarizing wide receiver in this class at this point, at least on like the higher end, of how people are viewing guys in this class. He doesn't look that great in my model. I remember when he was like the consensus wide receiver one, I plugged him in and I was like, this doesn't look right. Something's a little bit off here. Other people who look at things through analytics the way and numbers the way that I do like him a lot though. So I think that you can go a lot of different ways depending on the lens you're sort of viewing this from. I'm very curious about what reception perception says about Quentin Johnston. And do you think that his physicality, because that seems to be obviously the number one trait for him, do you think that can translate to the NFL?
Yeah, you're not going to be surprised by this because, you've known me for years, and I think people who've followed my work for years are not going to be surprised to hear I come down somewhere in the middle here on the Quentin Johnston.
I feel that.
Yeah, I'm not on really either side of the extreme where, I know some people have him. Yeah, they don't like him at all. Some people, like you said, have him as the top receiver in the class. I come down kind of somewhere in the middle there because I think you can see the strengths and the weaknesses. He has actually an extremely high success rate versus man coverage, third best in the class, 74.8. But he really falls off against zone, 12th percentile success rate there, 59th against press. Not terrible, but not great. And really his success comes on a small handful of routes, 9 routes, slant routes, post routes, some corners, deep out, stuff like that. But definitely a very limited role, only really lining up sort of on one side of the field there. But you get a ton of look of him as an X receiver. And so in terms of his pure like separation ability, I think he's got potential to be a really good route runner because he shows the fluidity at that size to do it. It's just right now, again, he's very limited in what they asked him to do at TCU and really where he was successful. It's a lot of deep routes, a lot of deep overs, slants, stuff like that. I think one thing that's really interesting about Johnston is sort of the other stuff where he's great after the catch. We know that RP data would back that up as well. It's the contested catch stuff in the hands that's really troubling, right? Like it's so funny because we're looking at Quentin Johnston and part of the appeal is he's 6'3", he's over 200 pounds. He stands out in this receiver class, but he might play the smallest of all of them, in terms of the way he wins after the catch and his contested catch rate, which for me is below 50%. It's not really where you want it to be, 46.2%. Actually, you want it to be much higher than that, especially to play that role. So I actually think he's pretty similar to Christian Watson last year. And even when Christian Watson came in and had great success in the second half of his rookie season, I'm telling you, he's not doing it as like a refined route runner. He's not doing it across the full route tree. It's a lot of slants, deep overs, vertical routes, stuff like that, getting him in space where, again, I think Quentin Johnston is freakier in space and after the catch than he was deep down the field. And I felt the same way about Christian Watson, who I compared to Martavis Bryant last year. So I think these guys are all on like that axis of wide receivers.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. I mean, my model spit out T. Higgins as a comp for Quentin Johnston, but then on the number 2 guy was Brashad Perriman. So it was like, that's why when you say that you're living in the middle with Johnston, I kind of am too, because I can see this range of outcomes and see that it can go in a lot of different directions. So that was good insight with him. Let's talk about Zay Flowers. I have a feeling that this is the guy that you probably like as your wide receiver too. And it's really, really interesting because Flowers is not someone that really checks the high level analytical boxes, that folks look for in a wide receiver. He's not an early declare receiver. He didn't have some super, super elite breakout age. His production was fine, but it wasn't amazing. Obviously, that production is within the context of his offense, but obviously his offense had a lot of struggles as well. But now he's getting Antonio Brown comps, and obviously that should get anyone excited because of what Antonio Brown can do on the field. So I'm curious, do you think that Zay Flowers is getting that kind of comp, getting that kind of love from folks because this wide receiver draft class isn't necessarily as good as what we've seen in recent memory? Or do you think that he really does have that kind of juice?
Yeah. 2 things. Well, a lot of things here, but yeah, he is the guy that I rank second. But again, to go back to the stacked board ranking that I mentioned, like for me, again, Jaxon Smith-Njigba is in my second tier of prospects from the last 3 classes combined, but he's the only one in this class there. So then all of these guys we've talked about so far, Addison, Flowers, and Quentin Johnston, and one other guy is is in this third tier, but they're all pretty similar. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
splitting hairs in terms of, do I prefer
Sure.
Zay Flowers over these other guys? Also, by the way, we'll come back to Flowers in just a second, not to hijack your show, but I'm curious about this because we just talked about Quentin Johnston, and we're talking about these other two guys, Flowers and Addison. I have Treylon Burks actually right in this group. Who do you think is a better, like those four guys we've just talked about? And then we can get back to Flowers in a second. Flowers, Addison, Treylon Burks, Quentin Johnston. Do you think Burks is like a better prospect than all those guys, or where do you think?
He looks the best analytically, I can say that. But I don't think that it's like so dramatically different. Like last year, my model had the big three as the big three. It had Drake London as the wide receiver one, and then it had Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave there too. And then, from there, it was this lumping of like Jameson Williams, Treylon Burks, and then Jahan Dotson was kind of ish close, but he wasn't necessarily quite there. I would probably prefer Treylon Burks over these guys because I think that the upside and the tools that are there's just more of a ceiling from a fantasy perspective. But I think that if you're looking at like median outcome, I would feel more comfortable probably with a Zay Flowers or a Jordan Addison.
Yeah, I think I feel I like Flowers and Addison better than Burks, but I went back and forth between who do I like better as prospects, Johnston and Burks. And people, people can subscribe to see how I came down to that one. But back to Zay Flowers, who, I have as the second ranked receiver in this class. The Antonio Brown comps are funny because I've said this on a lot of shows this offseason, but I think it bears repeating that I think if you compare a player to Antonio Brown, you deserve a 30-day minimum, jail sentence. Right to jail, right away. No questions asked. Because he's one of the people forget because of how his career has ended now at this point. He's like naked in pools at this point. He's a guy who was like playing at a top 5 all-time level at his peak.
Yeah.
Was legitimately insane. But I get the reason why people make that comparison because of how Zay Flowers plays. And I think the biggest thing here is you get a lot of snaps from Zay Flowers at every single receiver position, including the X receiver position. Like I mentioned, he took 58.2% of his snaps behind the line of scrimmage and 48.1% on the line of scrimmage. Like you get him playing some real X receiver stuff. And the big difference between Flowers and Addison, why I eventually decided I like Flowers better, 72.7% success rate versus press for Zay Flowers. That's the 79th percentile. It's quite a bit better than where Jordan Addison came out. Like I think if there's a receiver who plays above his size, it's absolutely Zay Flowers to me. And I'm really confident that he could potentially hack it as an outside receiver at his size and, maybe even be a true X receiver if he goes down that Antonio Brown archetype. I'll not say comparison, but yeah, I love his route running. I love his explosiveness. He makes plays after the catch. We know that he'll make like some dazzling catches, but he's a bit of a mistake prone player as well. So to bring it back to the Steelers, I've compared him to Deontay Johnson, who is a great route runner, a really good technician, actually plays as like a true X receiver and has at different times of his career, but he's a very mistake prone player. So I was like, you know what? I'll give him the Bud Light, Antonio Brown comparison, which is basically Deontay Johnson, but with a layer of like boneheaded plays in there. So I ended up going with that comp for Zay Flowers.
I like that. I like that a lot. I mean, the thing with Flowers too, and this is definitely not as quantitative as people would probably think that I would take that I would have, but Zay Flowers showing up to the combine with so much more muscle. It's he's got that dog in him, like he clearly
really does.
He clearly wants this. And I think when you combine that with the fact that only 33% of his snaps came from the slot his final season. I mean, he's playing the perimeter at this like 180 pound frame, shows up the combine 15 pounds heavier or whatever it was. I think that he's clearly got the right mindset to be able to play that kind of role because you need that kind of mindset to play that kind of role at the NFL level. So I'm with you. He's been a big climber for me, despite the analytical profile just being like, it's not bad. It's just very average, sort of like a Jahan Dotson type, like analytical profile. Not that he's that kind of player, but from an analytical profile standpoint, that's sort of what he looks like. Let's move on to a guy who really thrived in the slot and probably will thrive in the slot in the NFL. That's Josh Downs. He looks almost exactly like Elijah Moore in my prospect model. He profiles as a primary slot, but he does look like he is a very, very good player. So I'm curious what you're seeing with him.
Yeah, I'm a big Josh Downs fan. He actually has the highest success rate versus man coverage among the prospects I've charted this year. And, again, smaller sample size, similar with Elijah Moore, smaller sample size from a press coverage standpoint, but just 8% of his routes sampled, he went against press coverage for me, but 76.9%, that's an 86 percentile scores. Again, very similar to Elijah Moore in that way that when you saw him go against physical press man coverage, he was awesome in college. And I think Elijah Moore, his career's gone a little weird, but in his rookie season, he was awesome as an outside receiver.
Yeah.
And I think that, Josh Downs, again, is he going to be an outside receiver? I don't know, but man, I mean, he's definitely a receiver who excels despite his size. JJ, he actually has my highest contested catch rate in this class. And that's what's so interesting to me. Like, we're talking about the guy who's 5'9", 170 pounds, 93.8% contested catch rate, which is just hilarious. And a decent sample size too. 18% of his sampled targets were a contested target for me. So like, his quarterback, Drake May, this past year really trusted him like in tight coverage situations. Josh Downs won in those tight coverage situations. I know there's always like a ceiling question for a player like this, but I could see him being like in the Tyler Lockett, which again, that was my prospect comp for Elijah Moore. So we're talking the same bucket of players here. I also think he's very similar to Sterling Shepard, who I'm sure you remember I was like huge Sterling Shepard guy coming out. I still to this day maintain that if Sterling Shepard had never started getting injured, like the moment that Odell Beckham got traded, I mean, Sterling Shepard, he would have been a great player. I mean, every time he's on the field, he gets like 10 plus targets every single time.
That's true.
So, yeah, I think he's in like that archetype of receiver, which maybe doesn't excite everybody, but I love route runners like this.
No, I mean, look, it's not like the most amazing class in the world. And I don't think that you just need to have wide receiver one ceiling to warrant a rookie draft pick in general. I think that's totally fine to have these kinds of players on your team. People who drafted Tyler Lockett were not disappointed throughout his career to have him on their fantasy squad. So, I like that a lot about Downs. Marvin Mims, I feel like if there's one wide receiver who is getting arguably the most hype within the fantasy space, not the real life space. The real life space, they're more into like the bigger guys like the Mingos or the Tillmans. But I think within the fantasy space, people are really, really loving Marvin Mims. My model likes him. Hard to not like him analytically. I'm curious where you have Marvin Mims.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago it was like Marvin Mims week, seemingly on Twitter. Anytime you got on the Bird app, everybody's talking about Marvin Mims. I like Marvin Mims. I'm kind of I'm not quite all the way there as high as some people are. Definitely the analytical profile is really good. I've read that in your draft guide, which is awesome. Everybody, I don't need to tell everybody to download your draft guide. You're listening to the podcast. Come on. But yeah, I mean, in terms of his ability to win down the field, 9 routes, post routes, corner routes, deep outs, those are all really good routes for him. He shows you some ability to work underneath as well, like slant routes, flat routes, stuff like that. It's everything kind of in the intermediate area, when he's going to have to run a dig route against man coverage. I think he's more of a speed slot receiver. He's a guy that you almost never see run against press coverage, but didn't really shine in the very, very small reps that you have there. He feels very similar to John Brown, another guy that, I loved John Brown when he was in the league. So John Brown to me, I always thought was like a fringy number 1 type high end number 2 receiver. So maybe Mims could go down that axis, like the T.Y. Hilton, John Brown axis of receivers, but I could also see him topping out as a really good number 3 receiver that's going to push things vertically. I love like speed slot receivers are awesome because I think they stretch the defense in such unique and challenging ways. And it is kind of weird that I actually think he might end up being a better real life player than a fantasy player, and yet it seems like the hype, as you mentioned, is coming from the like different side there.
Yeah. I mean, look, I like him. I don't want anyone to walk away from the show thinking that I don't like him. I just know that there are people out there who are in love with him, like putting him in that same, like I don't have him in the Addison tier, for instance.
No,
but I do think he's good. Like I think that he's someone that I would say someone that you should target in your rookie draft, but if everyone's hyping him up, then he might not become the most obvious target in the world. But with that being said, I do think that he's a very, very good player, really good analytical profile, had good production all 3 years in school, early declare, all that good stuff. And his ADOTs in college, like you mentioned, just out of control, the way that they used him there.
So high.
One player who's seen his stock drop quite a bit over the last few months, really, I mean, you could say the last year, is Kayshon Boutte. Are you nervous about him at all? I usually don't care a ton about athleticism, partially because athleticism is typically embedded in draft capital in some way. We don't see like these horrible athletes get drafted in the first or second round generally. And we might not see that with Boutte either. But I am a little bit concerned about his like poor testing. And it just seems like he's not the most motivated in the world out there on a football field. And so I think that it all combines to like create this narrative around him that just scares the living what out of me. So what are you seeing with Booty?
I mean, he like stood on most of his terrible times from the combine at his pro day too, which
right. Yes.
which was like stunning, and I think might speak to some of the concerns that you just brought up there about how like motivated he is. Yeah, I have a tough time with him. Not one of the prospects I'm super excited about in terms of like we're looking for potential sleepers in the class. Like, yeah, to me there are a lot of other guys I prefer if we're looking for players, but he definitely shows you flashes. I just can't quite figure out like where he's going to fit. And when I have this many questions from an on-field perspective, and then we have this many questions from like a what the hell happened to your career, and like why now are we still asking questions about the testing stuff and the motivation? I don't know. There are just a lot of other guys in the class I'm excited about.
All right, so my favorite sleeper in this class, and I've DM'd you about this, we talked about this a little bit, is Jayden Reed. And this is me selfishly bringing this up on the show because it's not like Jayden Reed is this like top 5 prospect within this class. But he posted great numbers as a freshman at Western Michigan, and he did that in the same system that Sky Moore played in. And he actually had a better freshman season within the context of his offense than Sky Moore had. So I saw that. And then I see what he did at Michigan State. He lined up everywhere at Michigan State. He was in the backfield at times. He returned kicks and punts. And so as a result, one of his comps in my model was, I mean, I it's weird saying this, but one of my comps in the model was Stephon Diggs for Jayden Reed. And so all of that combined, I'm like, what if this guy is actually very, very good? Look, I look back at my model and the players going back to 2011, and I look at like Stephon Diggs' profile, and I'm like, how the heck did this happen? Like how was he not just like at least a second round pick? Just looking at all of this, right? But I don't think that Jayden Reed stands out like Stephon Diggs did analytically, but there are some parallels. There are some similarities. So what are you seeing out of Reed?
Yeah, I'm a big Jayden Reed fan. I like him more than Marvin Mims, who we've talked about. I like he's one of my favorite kind of like, I hope he goes in the 3rd round type of bets. I think he's a very good player. And you mentioned it. I think one thing that's really exciting about him is that similar to Zay Flowers, you get to see him play all 3 receiver positions on the line of scrimmage for 47% of his sample snaps, off the line for 53%. He took 38% of his snaps outside on the right, 30% on the left, and was lined up in the slot for 26%. And that actually left-right distinction is important because a lot of these guys like Jordan Addison was almost exclusively a right side receiver. Quentin Johnson almost exclusively left side. Like typically you see these guys tethered to one side of the field. And just from a body mechanics standpoint, not only are you never going to see that in the NFL, like you're never going to see one guy. Like I think the highest I have is like DK Metcalf's rookie season. He was like 60% or 65% one side. And that was outside of DeAndre Hopkins and Cliff Kingsbury, which is actually another conversation entirely. But typically you're not going to see someone on the field, like one side of the field for a ton because body mechanic wise, it's a lot harder to flip yourself around and it's important. Anyways, that's really dorky stuff. But what the stuff I like about Jayden Reed, not just you see him play all 3 receiver positions, is I think he's got the makings of being a very good route runner. He actually has the highest success rate versus press in the class for me, 70.3% success rate versus man coverage, which is in the Flowers Addison zone in this class, and 79% success rate versus zone, which is a pretty solid mark as well, 53rd percentile among college prospects. So I like Jayden Reed a lot, and he shows you pretty good ball skills as well. Like not a dominant contested catch guy, but 64% of his contested catches or contested targets he won. I told you this, I think in DMs, JJ. I've said it before on other places too. I think he's like 2 tweaks away from being a really, really good player.
Yeah.
He's a little bit Terry McLaurin-esque to me, and who I think is pretty similar to Stephon Diggs as well. So again, same axis of wide receivers here, that they can be these really good route runners while also being, outside receivers who play that X receiver position and became the reason like McLaurin, I think, is sneakily elite, even though people don't want to talk about it. I think he's elite. And I think that Stephon Diggs is obviously elite is because not only are they these great separators, they're also great in the contested catch game. And again, like, timing his leaps a little bit better, being more consistent at the catch point. Like Reed could get there, but it's just like a couple tweaks, and I think he'd be a really great player.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're saying is, and what we're saying is, he's going to be a good value in rookie drafts this year, Jaden Reed.
Oh, totally. Yeah, he's one of these guys that I can't wait to see where he lands because, McLaurin was someone that landed on like a light depth chart in Washington. I don't even remember who was playing, but usually a light depth chart in Washington and ended up becoming the top receiver right away because he was so fundamentally sound. And that's kind of what I think Jalen Reed could be, a guy who goes up that range. And if not, maybe he's like a Russell Gage type player, a guy who has a couple of moments and is a smaller player, but can beat man coverage. I think that those are kind of good comparisons for Jaden Reed.
There are tons of other wide receivers in this class we haven't talked about. Let's end the show by talking about some of the wide receivers that you like, that we haven't been able to talk about, that you see as sleepers, that you think are overrated, underrated, whoever. Just talk about some wide receivers. Let the listeners hear it.
Yeah, I really like Jonathan Mingo. I know you mentioned him earlier, and he's someone that I definitely think NFL people will like more than fantasy people because I know his like analytical profiles. Didn't he have like a bunch of seasons, but like 400 yards or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Well, what's interesting is, and we're recording this on Monday for the Tuesday show, I sent an email blast out literally earlier today, basically saying, hey, look, Jonathan Mingo's profile is pretty trash. Like on paper, it does not look good analytically. And there's really not that many comps that you can totally look to, maybe like a Chase Claypool, maybe like a Michael Pittman or something like that. That was another guy who sort of looked semi-similar analytically. But at the same time, when you're layering on top the average draft position data and where people are drafting these guys, he's still an afterthought for the most part within the market. So there's at least traits that you seem to be able to latch onto. And I'm curious, so what are some of those traits that you really like with him? Because that's going to get people to probably latch on him and get him in the third round of their rookie drafts this year.
Yeah, and he's someone that I think we're all excited for, like trying to find some good big receivers in this class because there's so many smaller guys. But and he's 6'2" and 220, and like he played at Ole Miss, so everybody's going to talk about AJ Brown. I actually think that he's more of like the power slot receiver mold. And something I have in his profile, Jonathan Mingo's, is that his collegiate data at Ole Miss from RP last year, a lot of the success rates, which aren't super high on paper, but they are almost identical to Amon-Ra St. Brown when he was coming out of USC in 2021. And Amon-Ra St. Brown in his RP sample was a 70% outside player. Jonathan Mingo was a 65% outside player on the left side of the field. But, and again, this is on the website. People can look at Amon-Ra's profile and see like the whole time, like, yeah, this guy's a big slot receiver. He's a power slot receiver. He should be like in the Cooper Kupp role, which is basically exactly what's happened with Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I think that Jonathan Mingo would fit really well in that role. He's probably the best blocking receiver in this class. I'm sure the dynasty listeners are just, they're just trying to, just salivating with excitement, trying to contain their enthusiasm. Keep the pants on, folks. Best blocking receiver in the class. But you see Ole Miss bring him in like tight to the line of scrimmage, bring him in the backfield to get a use of that like heft, similar to what the Packers have done with Allen Lazard at times over the last couple of years. So I think that's a good kind of comparison for him. That Amon-Ra St. Brown role comparison could be good for Jonathan Mingo, who does play like bully ball after the catch in the contested catch game. I just feel like an NFL team's going to like him more than he will, go in the fantasy world and stuff like that. But if he finds that right role, just like St. Brown did, I mean, St. Brown was a guy, I know we're in a league together and I'm a coward. I took Kadarius Toney over Amon-Ra St. Brown the year those guys came out. And I hated Toney's profile and I loved St. Brown's more, but it was just, the one guy went the fourth round, one guy went the first round. What are you going to do? So I'm still hating myself for that one. But yeah, no, like Mingo, I think could be in that type of role. I also like Puka Nacua, as a day three receiver, could be somebody that's really interesting. Another guy that shows you ability to play all three receiver positions, I think is a pretty nice separator and plays well in tight coverage. Those are two guys I think might go well. Mingo might go on day two, and I rank him as a day two player, but Puka's a guy who might go on the third day, who's an interesting sleeper too.
Matt, my friend, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this year's wide receiver class. For anyone not following Harmon on Twitter, make sure you change that and find him at MattHarmon_BYB. You should also check out his work over on Yahoo and at receptionperception.com. And as usual, you can follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB and check out lateround.com for what I'm offering, including this year's late round prospect guide. We're just a little over a week away from the start of the draft, and the guide is the perfect way to get prepped from a fantasy football perspective. Thanks for listening, though, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. I'll be back in your ears later this week with the mailbag episode.